My home is not fancy by any standard, but it has always been my sanctuary. A modest three-bedroom ranch house with weathered blue siding that I inherited from my grandfather 5 years ago. It sits at an unusual spot, just before the entrance to the prestigious Oak Ridge Estates, where homes start at $500,000 and range up to 3 times that amount. My property has a unique layout, with a large side yard that extends along the curved road leading into their community. When I first moved in, I spent every weekend restoring the gardens my grandfather had lovingly maintained for decades. The front yard bloomed with native wildflowers, and the vegetable garden in the back provided me with fresh produce throughout the summer. My simple lifestyle contrasted sharply with the manicured perfection of Oak Ridge Estates, but there was a peaceful coexistence. I would wave at passing neighbors, and occasionally they would compliment the colorful flower beds that brightened their daily commute. The first incident happened on a Saturday morning in early spring. I was drinking coffee on my porch when I noticed a black SUV parked on the edge of my side yard. The driver, a woman in tennis clothes, hurried away toward the community clubhouse without a glance in my direction. I thought little of it at the time. Perhaps she was running late for a match and the clubhouse parking lot was full. By afternoon, the vehicle was gone, and I dismissed it as a one-time occurrence. Within a month, it became a pattern. First weekends, then weekday evenings, my side yard became what appeared to be the unofficial overflow parking for Oak Ridge Estates. Luxury vehicles would park haphazardly along the edge of my property, sometimes 2 or 3 deep. The grass began to show wear patterns, and my carefully planted border of lavender was repeatedly crushed under tires and footsteps. I made polite attempts to address the situation. I placed small decorative garden stones along the boundary. They disappeared within days. I put up modest, "Please do not park" signs. They were removed. When I approached drivers directly with reasonable requests to respect my property, I was met with dismissive waves or outright ignoring. "This is community overflow parking," one man told me without looking up from his phone. "It has been for years before you moved in." The situation escalated dramatically when I met Richard Harmon, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA president. He drove up in a gleaming white Mercedes one evening as I was placing new private property signs along my yard. He stepped out, not bothering to close his car door, and approached me with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. "Those signs are against community aesthetic guidelines," he informed me, his voice dripping with condescension. He was tall, impeccably dressed in golf attire, with the deeply tanned skin of someone who spent his retirement on golf courses. "This is not part of your community," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "This is my private property." Richard laughed, an uncomfortable sound that held no humor. "Look, I understand you are new to the area, but this arrangement was established long before you arrived. This section has always served as additional parking for our community events." "But the vehicles are damaging my lawn and garden," I protested, pointing to the muddy tire tracks and flattened plants. Richard glanced at the damage with obvious disinterest. "Perhaps you should consider hardscaping that area instead of these amateur gardening attempts. It would be more practical, given the established use." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with a sign in my hand, and the distinct feeling that in his world, my property rights did not matter. As more luxury vehicles pulled up and parked without hesitation on my increasingly damaged lawn, I realized this peaceful coexistence had come to an end. After weeks of escalating parking problems and property damage, I decided to take a more formal approach. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA held monthly meetings at their lavish community center, and residents from neighboring properties could attend the public portion. I marked the date on my calendar and spent the week documenting the damage to my property with photographs and dated notes. The evening of the meeting arrived, and I dressed in my best business casual outfit, a stark contrast to my usual gardening clothes or work uniform. The community center gleamed with expensive fixtures and designer furniture. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a pristine golf course, and a crystal chandelier hung over a polished conference table where the 7 HOA board members sat looking important. I took a seat in the back row of chairs set up for residents. Around me, people in designer clothes chatted about vacation homes and luxury car deliveries. No one acknowledged my presence or made any welcoming gestures. I felt distinct, out of place, like a dandelion in a rose garden. When the public comment period finally opened, I raised my hand and waited to be recognized. Richard Harmon, presiding over the meeting with a gavel that seemed unnecessarily formal, eventually nodded in my direction with obvious reluctance. "We have a guest from outside the community," he announced, emphasizing my outsider status. "Please keep your comments brief as we have important HOA business to attend to." I walked to the podium, my folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. The room fell silent, but not with respect. It was the silence of people forced to endure an unwelcome interruption. "Good evening," I began, my voice sounding smaller than intended in the large room. "I am here to address an ongoing issue with residents parking on my private property, which has resulted in significant damage to my lawn and garden." Before I could continue, a board member with perfectly styled silver hair interrupted. "Are you referring to the North Side Community Overflow area?" "I am referring to my side yard, which is being used as parking without my permission," I clarified, opening my folder to show the photographs. Ripples of laughter spread through the room. Richard exchanged knowing glances with other board members before responding. "That area has always been community overflow parking," he stated with authority. "Long before you purchased that property." His pause made it clear what he thought of my modest home. I pushed forward, passing the photos of damaged grass, crushed plants, and eroded soil to the board. "As you can see, the constant vehicle traffic is destroying my property." The images were passed around with casual disinterest. One board member barely glanced at them before passing them along. Another openly rolled her eyes. "Have you considered that your landscaping choices are simply not suited to the reality of your property location?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "That area has been used for parking for decades. It is part of the community tradition." "But it is not part of your community," I insisted. "I have checked my property deed, and that land belongs to me." This statement triggered open laughter from several HOA members. Richard leaned forward, speaking slowly as if to a child. "You clearly do not understand how things work around here. Properties in this area have certain established uses and expectations. Your deed may show technical ownership, but practical realities supersede paperwork." Another board member chimed in. "We have longtime residents who confirm that area has always been available for community use. Previous owners understood this arrangement." I felt my face grow hot with embarrassment and frustration. "But that does not change the legal ownership. I would like to request that the HOA instruct residents to stop parking on my property." Richard's smile did not reach his eyes. "We will take your concerns under advisement. However, I suggest you consult with a local real estate attorney about property use expectations in this area before making further complaints." The dismissal was clear. My time was up, my concerns deemed unworthy of serious consideration. As I gathered my ignored photographs and returned to my seat, whispers and smirks followed me. The meeting quickly moved on to discussions about new poolside furniture and upcoming social events. I left the meeting with my dignity in tatters but my determination intact. Returning home, I spread out every document related to my property on the kitchen table. The deed, the property transfer papers from my grandfather, tax assessments, and county records. If they wanted to dismiss me with vague claims about established use, I would arm myself with irrefutable facts about legal ownership. As I pored over the documents late into the night, my eye caught something unusual on the property survey included with my grandfather's deed. The boundary lines extended much further than I had realized, following the curve of the access road into Oak Ridge Estates. I traced the line with my finger, a small smile forming as I realized there might be more to my modest inheritance than I had understood. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt a glimmer of hope. The county record's office was housed in a dusty basement of the municipal building. Unlike the gleaming Oak Ridge Estates Community Center, this place felt frozen in time, with flickering fluorescent lights and the musty smell of old paper. I took a number from a dispenser and waited among other citizens seeking property information, tax records, and building permits. An hour later, a clerk named Margaret called my number. She had kind eyes behind outdated glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who had worked with public records for decades. "I need to verify the exact boundaries of my property," I explained, sliding the deed and my grandfather's survey across the counter. "There seems to be some confusion about where my land ends." Margaret studied the documents carefully before typing information into an ancient computer. "Your property was part of the old Millfield farm before the development went in," she commented. "Those original parcels often have interesting boundary quirks." She printed several maps and laid them side by side, tracing boundaries with a pencil. "According to these records, your property includes not just your house and yard, but extends along here." Her pencil followed a line that clearly encompassed the entire access road leading into Oak Ridge Estates. My heart raced. That cannot be right. That would mean I own the only road into their subdivision. Margaret nodded slowly. "When the developer built Oak Ridge 20 years ago, they purchased most of the old farm property but apparently never secured an easement or purchased the access road. Your grandfather retained ownership of that strip. It should have been addressed during development with a proper easement agreement, but it appears it was simply overlooked." I stared at the maps in disbelief. "So legally, that road is my private property?" "According to county records, yes," Margaret confirmed. "Though typically in these situations, there would be an easement agreement allowing for access. I do not see any such agreement on file." I left the records office with certified copies of all relevant documents, my mind racing with implications. To verify what I had learned, I contacted a professional surveyor recommended by Margaret. 2 days later, Martin Weber walked my property, taking measurements and consulting GPS coordinates. He was methodical and precise, placing small orange flags at true boundary points. I followed him, watching in amazement as the flags continued far beyond what I had assumed was my property, extending along the entire length of the road that served as the only entrance to Oak Ridge Estates. "There is no question about it," Martin confirmed, showing me his digital renderings. "This entire access road sits on your property. There is no recorded easement granting the HOA or the residents legal right of passage. Technically, they have been trespassing on your land since the development was built." Armed with this information, I scheduled a consultation with Andrea Palmer, a property rights attorney with a reputation for taking on difficult cases. Her office was modest compared to the corporate firms that likely represented Oak Ridge estates, but her walls displayed numerous credentials and awards. Andrea listened attentively as I explained the situation, examining the surveys and records with careful attention. When I finished, she looked up with a confident smile. "This is quite straightforward from a legal perspective," she said. "Without an easement or right-of-way agreement, you have complete control over who can and cannot access your property, including that road. The fact that it has been used as access for 20 years does create some complexity due to potential prescriptive easement claims, but the ongoing trespass and property damage to your yard significantly strengthens your position." "What does this mean in practical terms?" I asked, still trying to process the magnitude of this discovery. "It means you hold considerable leverage," Andrea explained. "You could potentially restrict access to the road entirely, though that would likely trigger immediate legal action. More reasonably, you could negotiate terms for a formal easement agreement, including compensation for past trespass and damage." I drove home along the road that I now knew belonged to me, seeing it with new eyes. Luxury vehicles sped past without a glance in my direction, their drivers unaware they were crossing my property. The power of this knowledge felt both exhilarating and frightening. I was a private person who avoided conflict, not someone who looked for fights with wealthy neighbors. For several days, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to take immediate action, to assert my rights forcefully after months of dismissal and disrespect. Another part hesitated, concerned about escalating a neighborhood dispute into a legal battle with people who had far more resources than I did. The decision was made for me the following weekend. I returned home from grocery shopping to find an Oak Ridge Estates landscaping crew digging up the border of native wildflowers along my side yard. A supervisor directed workers who were replacing my plants with the same uniform shrubs used throughout the HOA community. "Excuse me," I called out, hurrying from my car. "What are you doing? This is my property." The supervisor barely glanced at me. "HOA Improvement Project. The board approved aesthetic enhancements to the community entrance and overflow parking area." "But this is not HOA property," I protested. "You cannot remove my plants without permission." He sighed with exasperation and pointed to a work order on his clipboard. "Look, I just go where they tell me. Take it up with the board if you have a problem." As I watched them continue to destroy my grandfather's carefully cultivated wildflower garden, something hardened inside me. The months of parking, the dismissal at the meeting, and now this brazen trespass and destruction crossed a line. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my politeness for submission. I went inside and called Andrea Palmer. "I am ready to move forward," I told her, my voice steady with resolve. "Please prepare whatever documents we need to assert my property rights. All of them." The next 2 weeks transformed my kitchen into a command center for what Andrea called Operation Property Recovery. My usual space for quiet morning coffee became crowded with land surveys, legal documents, and property records spread across every surface. I took a week of vacation time from work to focus entirely on building my case and strategy. Andrea advised a methodical approach rather than an emotional reaction. "Proper documentation is your most powerful weapon," she explained during one of our planning sessions. "Every instance of trespass, every damaged plant, every unauthorized use of your property needs to be recorded and dated." I purchased security cameras and installed them at strategic points along my property line. Within days, I had compiled hours of footage showing Oak Ridge residents casually parking on my lawn, walking across my gardens, and treating my property as an extension of their community. The most telling footage captured an HOA maintenance crew actually moving my private property signs and replacing them with overflow parking markers. To strengthen my position, I consulted with additional experts. A horticulturist assessed and documented the damage to my garden, providing a detailed report with cost estimates for restoration. A real estate appraiser calculated how the unauthorized use had diminished my property value. The county zoning administrator confirmed that my property was not zoned for public parking and had never been designated as such in any official capacity. Each consultation built my confidence and reinforced what Andrea had told me. Legally, my position was unassailable. The question was not whether I had the right to control access to my property, including the road, but how best to assert that right without immediately triggering a costly legal battle. We need to give them an opportunity to correct their behavior before taking more dramatic steps, Andrea advised. A formal notice establishing your ownership claims and documenting the violations creates a paper trail that strengthens our position if this does eventually go to court. Together, we drafted a certified letter to the Oak Ridge Estates HOA board. The document was professional but firm, including certified copies of property records, photographs of the damage, and a summary of applicable laws regarding private property rights. It concluded with reasonable requests: immediate cessation of parking on my yard, removal of unauthorized overflow parking signs, restoration of damaged landscaping, and the initiation of good faith negotiations regarding a formal easement agreement for the access road. I reviewed the letter multiple times before signing it, ensuring it conveyed authority without hostility. This is not about revenge, I reminded myself. This is about respect for property rights and fair treatment. The letter was sent by certified mail, requiring signature confirmation. 3 days later, I received proof of delivery, signed by Richard Harmon himself. I waited anxiously for a response, checking my mail and email multiple times daily. When the response finally came, it was not what I had expected. Rather than a formal letter on HOA stationery, I received a hastily scribbled note on my original letter. Claims noted. No action warranted. Consult HOA Bylaws Section 7.3 regarding community access rights. It was initialed RH rather than formally signed. I showed the response to Andrea, who shook her head in disbelief. "This level of dismissal actually works in our favor," she said. "It demonstrates they have been properly notified of your claims and have chosen to ignore them. This strengthens our position for the next steps." The next phase of our plan required more aggressive action. I ordered custom, no trespassing, and private property signs that specifically referenced applicable state laws. Andrea prepared legal documents asserting my ownership, rights to the access road, and notifying residents that a new access agreement would need to be negotiated. I also took physical steps to protect my property. I purchased removable bollards that could be installed along my property line to prevent parking, and researched options for a gate system that could be installed across the access road if necessary. Throughout this preparation phase, the parking situation actually worsened. Word had apparently spread through Oak Ridge Estates about my letter, and it seemed some residents were deliberately parking on my property as a show of defiance. My security cameras captured people laughing as they walked across my damaged lawn, and one night, several of my preliminary boundary markers were pulled up and tossed aside. Rather than discouraging me, these actions strengthened my resolve. Each new instance of trespass and property damage was meticulously documented and added to our growing file of evidence. They think this is still about a patch of grass and some flowers, I told Andrea as we finalized our plans. They have no idea what is really at stake. On the final evening before our plan was to be implemented, I stood at my window watching luxury cars drive past on what I now knew was my road. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt not anxiety but certainty. The tables were about to turn in a way the residents of Oak Ridge Estates could never have anticipated. Tomorrow, I said to myself, everything changes. I woke before dawn on implementation day, a mixture of nervousness and determination coursing through me. The sky was just beginning to lighten as I carried the first of the heavy, private property, no trespassing signs to the edge of my lawn. These were not the flimsy plastic signs that had been repeatedly removed, but substantial metal signs mounted on treated posts, each citing specific legal statutes regarding private property rights. By sunrise, I had installed 6 signs at key points along my property line, including 2 marking the boundaries of the access road where it connected to the public street. Each sign was photographed in place, its GPS coordinates recorded as Andrea had instructed. I also activated additional security cameras positioned to monitor the signs and property boundaries. The reaction began almost immediately. A morning jogger from Oak Ridge Estates stopped abruptly at the sight of the new signs, openly scowling before continuing her run. By 7:30 a.m., as residents began their morning commutes, cars slowed to examine the signs, some drivers taking photos with their phones. At 9:17 a.m., my security camera captured the first attempt to remove a sign. A man in business attire parked his BMW at the edge of my yard, marched directly to one of the road boundary signs, and attempted to pull it from the ground. When it did not budge due to the concrete footing I had installed, he kicked it repeatedly before returning to his car and speeding away. By mid-morning, my phone began ringing with calls from unknown numbers, which I did not answer as per Andrea's instructions. Text messages from unfamiliar numbers appeared, ranging from inquiries about the signs to thinly veiled threats about consequences for disrupting community access. I documented each communication without responding. The confrontation I had been bracing for arrived shortly before noon. A white Mercedes pulled into my driveway, and Richard Harmon emerged, clutching what appeared to be legal documents. He marched to my front door and pounded with unnecessary force. Following our prepared protocol, I activated my phone's recording app before answering. Richard did not wait for a greeting. "Remove those signs immediately," he demanded, his face flushed with anger. "You are in violation of community standards and causing unnecessary alarm among residents." I remained calm, just as Andrea and I had practiced. The signs accurately reflect my property boundaries and rights. They will remain in place. Richard thrust the papers toward me. "This is a cease and desist letter from the HOA legal team. Those signs are creating a hostile environment and interfering with established community access. Remove them today or face legal action." I did not take the papers. "Please have your attorneys contact my attorney directly, Andrea Palmer with Palmer Legal Services. I am exercising my legal rights as the property owner." "Property owner," Richard scoffed. "You own a small residential lot, not the community access areas. These pranks will result in serious consequences." "I own more than you realize," I replied evenly, "including the entire access road to Oak Ridge Estates, as county records clearly show. Again, please have your attorneys contact mine for verification." Richard's expression flickered between disbelief and concern before hardening again. "You will regret this attempt at extortion. The HOA has resources you cannot imagine." After he left, I called Andrea to report the encounter. "Exactly as expected," she said. "Now we move to phase 2. That evening, after most residents had returned home, a small team arrived at my house. 2 were friends who had offered to help, and the third was a licensed contractor Andrea had recommended. With the property survey and installation plan in hand, we quickly set up. Removable bollards at strategic points along my side yard, physically preventing vehicles from parking on my lawn. We worked efficiently in the gathering dusk, completing the installation as darkness fell. The following morning, chaos erupted. Residents arriving at the community clubhouse for early fitness classes discovered they could no longer park in their usual overflow area. My security cameras captured their confusion and growing anger. Several attempted to move the bollards but found them securely installed. Others called out to each other, gesturing angrily toward my house. By mid-morning, the HOA office was fielding so many complaints that a mass text alert was sent to all Oak Ridge residents. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight 7 p.m. Ray. Access issues. All residents urged to attend." Throughout the day, I documented multiple confrontations between residents and the physical barriers. Some tried to drive around them, only to get stuck in the softer ground of my yard. Others parked illegally on the public road, resulting in several vehicles being ticketed by local police. Richard Harmon personally inspected each bollard, taking photographs and making phone calls that I could see were becoming increasingly agitated based on his body language. Andrea called me mid-afternoon. "The HOA's attorney contacted me," she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "They're demanding an immediate meeting." "What did you tell them?" I asked. "That we would be happy to attend tonight's HOA meeting to discuss property boundaries and access issues, and that we would bring all relevant documentation." She paused. "Are you ready for this? Once we reveal the road ownership, things will escalate quickly." I looked out at my yard, at the gardens my grandfather had planted that had been trampled and destroyed by entitled strangers who never bothered to consider that this land belonged to someone who cared about it. "I am ready," I confirmed. That evening, I dressed carefully in business attire, gathered the folder of documents Andrea had prepared, and drove to the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center. The parking lot was overflowing, with cars lining both sides of the public road. I parked in a visitor spot and waited for Andrea to arrive. She pulled up precisely at 6:45 p.m., professional and confident in a tailored suit, carrying a leather portfolio and a small projector case. "Remember," she said as we walked toward the building, "remain calm regardless of what they say. Let me do most of the talking. Your property rights are completely solid." The community center was packed with residents, many standing along the walls after all chairs had been filled. Conversations hushed as we entered, and I felt dozens of hostile gazes following us as we made our way to the front row of seats that had been reserved at Andrea's request. Richard Harmon called the meeting to order precisely at 7:00 p.m. His attempt at maintaining formal procedure undermined by the obvious tension in his voice. "We are here to address the unlawful and disruptive actions taken by a non-resident that are affecting our community access," he began, pointedly avoiding looking in my direction. Andrea stood before he could continue. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying authority that immediately commanded attention. "My client and I are here to discuss some significant property boundary matters that affect everyone in this room, Perhaps we should begin with the facts rather than allegations." The room fell silent as she connected her projector to display county property records on the wall screen. The HOA's attorney, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, leaned forward with growing concern as the property lines became clear for all to see. The revelation was about to begin. The community center fell into stunned silence as Andrea methodically presented irrefutable evidence of my property ownership. Detailed county maps, historical property records, and recent surveys appeared on the screen in succession, each one confirming the same unexpected truth. The only access road serving all 96 homes in Oak Ridge Estates ran entirely through my privately owned land. "As you can see from these certified county records," Andrea explained, her voice calm but authoritative, "when Oak Ridge Estates was developed 20 years ago, the developer purchased most of the old Millfield Farm property, but never secured legal ownership or a formal easement for this access corridor. This parcel has remained under continuous private ownership, transferred legally from Harold Miller to his grandson, my client, 5 years ago." Murmurs spread through the crowd as the implications began to sink in. I observed various stages of disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror on the faces of residents who had never considered that their only road home might not actually belong to their community. The HOA's attorney leaned toward Richard, whispering urgently as he examined the documents Andrea had provided. Richard's face grew increasingly pale as the attorney nodded repeatedly at whatever he was seeing in the paperwork. "This is absurd," called out a woman from the back. "That road has been used by this community for 20 years. You cannot just claim ownership now." Andrea addressed the question directly. "You are referring to the concept of prescriptive easement, which can indeed establish access rights after prolonged use. However, the law requires that such use be open, notorious, continuous, and uncontested for the statutory period. In this case, my client and his grandfather have consistently contested unauthorized use of their property, including this road, through posted signs, verbal notifications, and written communications. Additionally, the documented damage and trespass on the adjacent yard portion of the property further undermines any prescriptive easement claim." The HOA attorney stood, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "While these documents appear to show some unusual boundary configurations, the HOA has maintained this road and surrounding areas for decades. There are established community expectations that cannot simply be overturned." Andrea's response was immediate and precise. "Maintenance of private property without permission constitutes trespass, not evidence of ownership. Furthermore, I have here the complete road maintenance records from the county showing that primary road maintenance has been provided by county services, not the HOA. The minimal aesthetic maintenance the HOA has performed does not establish property rights." She displayed additional documents showing multiple instances where my grandfather had disputed unauthorized use of his property, including letters to the original developer and the HOA dating back 15 years. These communications had been consistently ignored or dismissed, but they established a clear pattern of contested use that legally prevented any prescriptive easement claim. The atmosphere in the room shifted as reality set in. Residents exchanged worried glances. Some began whispering calculations about how this might affect their property values. Others shot accusing looks at Richard and the board members, clearly wondering how such a critical oversight could have occurred. Richard attempted to reassert control, his voice noticeably less confident. "Even if these boundary claims have some technical merit, surely we can reach a reasonable accommodation that maintains access for the community. Disrupting access to 96 homes over a boundary technicality would be extreme and unnecessary. This was my cue to speak. I stood and faced the room, surprised at how steady my voice sounded despite my pounding heart. For 3 years, I have attempted reasonable accommodation. I have politely asked residents not to park on my lawn. I have placed signs that were removed. I have documented thousands of dollars in damage to my property from unauthorized parking and landscaping intrusions. I formally requested that the HOA address these issues. I paused, looking directly at Richard. The response I received was dismissal, mockery, and a suggestion that I did not understand how things work around here. Uncomfortable silence filled the room as many residents shifted in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own behavior or that of their neighbors. I am not interested in preventing residents from accessing their homes, I continued. I am interested in establishing respect for property rights, including mine. I am prepared to offer a formal easement agreement that would legally guarantee road access for all Oak Ridge residents under reasonable terms. Andrea distributed copies of our proposed terms to the board members and HOA attorney. The terms included 1. A one-time compensation payment for historical property damage and trespass. 2. A formal written apology from the HOA board for dismissing legitimate property concerns. 3. Reasonable annual maintenance fees for road upkeep. 4. Strict prohibition of parking on any portion of my yard. 5. Clear signage acknowledging the private ownership of the access road. 6. Removal of all unauthorized HOA landscaping from my property. You have 1 week to accept these terms or propose reasonable counteroffers, I concluded. After that time, I will be forced to exercise my legal right to restrict access to my private property during non-emergency hours. The room exploded in outraged voices. The HOA attorney quickly huddled with board members, their expressions grave. Richard attempted to call for order without success as residents directed increasingly hostile questions at him rather than at me. As Andrea and I gathered our documents to leave, she leaned close and whispered, "Well done. Now we wait." We walked out of the community center with purpose and dignity, leaving behind a neighborhood in turmoil, suddenly forced to reckon with the consequences of years of entitlement and disregard. The 7 days following the HOA meeting were tense but quiet. There were no more parking incidents on my lawn. The overflow parking signs disappeared overnight. Residents drove past my house with cautious glances, but no one approached me directly. The security cameras captured several groups of people stopping to examine the property boundary markers, pointing and discussing among themselves where the property lines ran. On the 6th day, I received an email from the HOA attorney requesting an urgent meeting extension. The board requires additional time to consult with legal experts regarding your proposal, it read. We request a 2-week extension before any access restrictions are implemented. After consulting with Andrea, I agreed to a 1-week extension only, maintaining pressure while showing reasonable flexibility. This proved to be the right strategy. 2 days into the extension, early on a Monday morning, the first concrete barriers were installed at my property boundary, where the access road met the public street. These were not permanent blockades, but were positioned to create a checkpoint of sorts, with a narrow passage that allowed only one vehicle through at a time, significantly slowing the morning commute for Oak Ridge residents. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Delivery trucks refused to navigate the restricted access. Landscaping services and maintenance crews canceled appointments. Residents found themselves waiting in long lines to enter or exit their neighborhood each morning and evening. By Wednesday, local news vans had arrived to cover the unusual neighborhood dispute. Reporters requested interviews, which I declined on Andrea's advice, but the HOA could not resist attempting to control the narrative. Richard appeared on the evening news, describing me as unreasonable and holding the community hostage. His performance backfired when the reporter asked pointed questions about how the HOA had failed to secure proper access rights during development. The real breakthrough came on Friday evening.